Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, come on, button. Let's go. Hey, good morning, everybody. Wow, I'm fighting with the mute button this morning. Good morning, everybody. It is Friday, October 4th, 2024. For some reason, I was just overwhelmed with the urge to say that it was 2027. It's not. Maybe I'll play this at a note to self. October 4th, 2027. I have to replay this show. All right, it is October 4th, 2024. Time for another show. We had one yesterday, so we might as well have one today. I guess that's the logic of it. We were off from the live show, but I decided that the Jack Smith filing, the special counsel filing in the Trump January 6th case was, well, too important to ignore. Didn't want to be off the air that day. But it presented us with an opportunity to, well, not decide which stories to share with you, but just stick to one. Of course, that made it probably nearly impossible for Scott Anderson to do a summary for the show. It's always difficult when I only do one or two subjects on a show. Well, what do you write? Well, he covered this. Maybe crack a joke about it and you show the link, and that's all there is to it. So I took that job over, but I think I might create that problem for him today, although I'm not certain. I have to check my calendar to see whether he's taking care of this stuff today or not. But at any rate, we might just do the same damn thing, even though there's lots of news to get to. And I think I do have to interrupt, and I'm not going to get all the way through the rest of the report anyway, so, I mean, this could drag on forever. It's 165 pages. We made it through almost 60, I think through 59 pages yesterday. So good on you and me for listening. I'm hopeful that it was either going to be the worst episode ever because nobody cared, or the audience cares. But I thought, well, maybe we're doing everybody a service. Everybody wants to read through this thing, but nobody has time to sit down and do it. But if you were already planning on wasting 2 hours of your day listening to the show, I figured I could give you a twofer and get you 2 hours into the special counsel motion. I think I've been calling it a report because it reads like a report. It's a very unusual filing, and a lot of people commenting on it are saying that Smith appears to have used the one chance he's got to get it all on the record before the election to just dump all this information. Or, there's usually a recitation of facts and then a legal analysis and then a suggested conclusion for the judge. But I don't know. It doesn't always have this long of a recitation and this detailed of a recitation. It really looks like he wanted to lay out his case before, because it may be the only chance to lay out this case. If Donald Trump wins or otherwise seizes power, he puts an end to the case, probably arrests Jack Smith, and bans the publication of this kind of compilation of the facts marshaled against him. It should also be recognized, Donald Trump is, of course, out railing and saying that Jack Smith did this to affect the outcome of the election, and it's his fault, and something, and probably, threatening to arrest him, throw him out of the country, execute him. Who knows if he were to become president. But the fact of the matter is that he filed the thing under seal and heavily redacted, too, and it was Judge Chutkan who said, no, this is actually not to be hidden from the public. It should be made public, and made the decision to go ahead and do that. So that only means that Trump, if he finds out, if he cares, I guess, will just transfer his anger to Chutkan. And it may be that his crowd doesn't know who Chutkan is, but they know who Jack Smith is. So he's just going to continue to rail about that. Anyway, I mentioned that there was other news, and I really do have to get some of these things on the record because they're kind of related to all of this. I'll start with, let's see. We'll start with this. Tina Peters. Do you remember Tina Peters? She was the clerk, the elections clerk in Mesa County, I think, Colorado. Someone we've covered before, spent a good deal of time covering her story, covering the story of her later arrest. She's every QAnon wackadoodle wrapped up in one. She's Marjorie Taylor Greene and QAnon and Mike Lindell, et cetera, et cetera. She's become something of a celebrity in right-wing circles and has been flying around the country, joining, stage presentations of idiots and wackadoodles who, spew their nonsense and then get a cut of the ticket price, essentially. But she's the one who also she put together a team to basically break into the storage facility where her county keeps the vote tabulating machines and the electronic voting machines, and came with false credentials as well and a fake expert, and they cracked open the machines and they stole the source code. They took the hard drives out. They dismantled machines, whatever it was that they did, in an effort to, quote unquote, prove that the machines were manipulating the vote and that the vote was rigged and Donald Trump really won. The whole QAnon package. Anyway, she was arrested. It's probably about 2 years ago. And do you remember the story? She was standing in line like at a Starbucks, a coffee shop or something, and the cops came to pick her up, and she made a whole privileged white lady stink about it, and yelling at the cops, "Don't you touch me, and I have a right." And like, you don't understand. You're under arrest. Well, you're hurting my wrist. Yeah, those are handcuffs. You're under arrest. The cops actually, I guess to no one's surprise, arresting a famous white lady, were remarkably tolerant, and probably anyone else would have gotten the truncheon on that. And maybe she should have. But, I guess we're not supposed to wish that on people. We hope that everybody is treated the way Tina Peters was treated when she was arrested. Anyway, she was arrested. She went on trial. The big news is, and the quick theme that we'll put together before we start reading more of the criminal charges or the argument against Donald Trump in the January 6th case, is that she's been sentenced now. I happen to have at hand here the New York Times' coverage of it. Former county clerk gets 9 years in prison for tampering with voting machines. Tina Peters, the former clerk of Mesa County, Colorado, had tried to prove that the machines had been used to rig the 2020 election against former President Donald J. Trump. They weren't. She didn't. And now she's going to prison. Alan Feuer covers it for the New York Times. It's not a long article. I just got to squeeze in what happened here. And you should take a look at the video of the sentencing. I actually did pocket a YouTube, I think, of the day's proceedings from this particular courtroom, and the bulk of it is sentencing for other defendants. It certainly doesn't seem to have much to do with the good stuff. But at about 2 hours and 33 minutes into it, if you want to scrub forward, is the Peters sentencing, and it's quite remarkable. But Alan Feuer writes it up this way. Tina Peters, the former clerk of Mesa County, Colorado, sentenced on Thursday to 9 years in prison after being found guilty in August of tampering with voting machines under her control in a failed attempt to prove that they had been used to rig the election. At a hearing in Grand Junction, Colorado, Judge Matthew D. Barrett, who I'm sure now has to, move into the witness protection program, scolded Ms. Peters sternly from the bench. This was the good part, telling her that he had imposed the severe penalty because she had repeatedly advanced false claims about Mr. Trump's defeat and in so doing become a celebrity among those who denied that he lost the race. And really what we're here for is this quote that he says to her in the sentencing, but you are no hero. You abused your position and you are a charlatan. You cannot help but lie as easily as you breathe. That's actually, they were pretty close in time. I watched the thing. But basically, he hands down the sentence and says, listen, I know you people all convince yourselves that you're martyrs for the cause. You're patriots and heroes fighting for truth, justice, and the American way. And it's us evil, the members of the evil cabal trying to keep you down, who are the real bad guys here. But look, it's not the case. You're a liar. You're a charlatan. You abused your position of power to make yourself a celebrity among liars, and you hit a cop. You didn't hit a cop, and you're going in. If you remember from Good Will Hunting, she actually did kick the cops. I think they tried to charge her with that as well. So, look, that's that's the upshot of it. I don't want to spend that much more time on it, but he does have a couple other good one-liners in there. The judge says, "I'm convinced you would do it again if you could. You're as defiant a defendant as I've ever seen." And he's probably right about that. So 9 years inside, 6 months in the county jail for some reason, and then 8.5 years in the pen. So bye QAnon wackadoodle lady. Speaking of bye to wackadoodle QAnon ladies, and I say there's a little bit of a theme here. Don't get your hopes up. There's a lot of these people, but there is also news somewhere. Oh, I got to scroll back for this one. What did I do with this one? All right, I'll have to look a little back. But a weirdo QAnon lady who became briefly famous as one of those. Well, she was a January 6th rioter. She was there. She then made videos. She was one of these people who makes videos in her car all the time, which is extraordinarily dangerous. You see her glancing between the camera and the street. She's driving. A lot of people pull over and make these things, or else they make them when they're driving and they don't really look at the camera very often. But she's very into looking at the camera. So she was a danger to herself and others. I mean, you could put it that way. And she made videos afterwards, and I think immediately afterwards, even on the ground and on January 6th, made a video about it. She was crying about she's been tear-gassed, and she was just, a patriot trying to stand up for America and blah, blah, blah. I can't, it's going to take me a while to find. There we go. And this got sent to me actually over Blue Sky by Remy Parker, who actually has the screen name or the address on Blue Sky Social of Rocket Mummy. So if you want to look for it, send me this note. QAnon assassin alert. Process server attempts to serve a January 6th participant / QNut ex-doctor at her foreclosed home. So, yeah, this is really interesting. I think she was a pediatrician. She looks like, a normal wackadoodle white lady with long blonde hair. You could see trouble coming, but she might be normal, but she might also be off the deep end. And you can kind of see it in the eyes, and you see it in the video. Anyway, she also made a rather famous video in her car in which she was explaining QAnon to people, and so sure of herself and being correct, she's actually lecturing people watching the video. I'm going to explain who or what is Q. She's very weird. And she's got the almost baby Fundy voice going. And she says, I want you to remember where you were. What your surroundings were. Where were you when you first heard, the truth about Q? Like this was an evangelical revelation. Well, anyway, so a process server came to, serve her for, I don't know whether she was being arrested for January 6th or the fact that she's living in a foreclosed home, displaying QAnon placards in the window, etc. Her life's gone down the toilet, in reality, but I guess she's famous among idiots. Anyway, somebody took a shot at the process server, and guess what? Wackadoodle lady has, in her circles, made the ultimate sacrifice. She gone. Snowflake, she's dead too. That's pretty amazing. So Tina Peters sentenced to 9 years in the pen, and this wacko lady shot and killed in the exchange with police. And I'm sure she thought she went down a hero, but don't bother with that. Just so long as you go down, that will be enough. I don't think she's even named in the link I've got, but in the comments, people are talking about who she is, what she was all about, displaying her videos. So I wanted to throw that in, and just as one more light-haired wackadoodle who's lost their brain, a woman who's lost their brain to QAnon. Marjorie Taylor Greene, still alive, but also still insisting that, they, and it is the high holy days, so we'll just come right out and say Jews, obviously, are controlling the weather again with space lasers. She doesn't go into that much detail, but she is apparently out there on the other site, Twitter, telling everybody that, yes, weather is controllable. Yes, it's in the hands of the government. Yes, that probably also means in the hands of Jews, and maybe space lasers are involved. But that Hurricane Helene was a targeted attack on Republican voters, you see. Yes, she says, they can control the weather. Yes, it's ridiculous for anyone to lie and say it can't be done. Unfortunately, she has a member's pin and floor access at the House of Representatives, is armed, a wackadoodle. I've always told you she's this far from just flipping out and doing a QAnon assassin thing and taking out members of Congress with her. She was, I guess, questioned. I don't know whether she's responding to Molly Jong Fast here, who's just saying, oh, yeah, they, right? But then Brendan Nyan was the one who had screenshotted this and shared it on Blue Sky. It's followed up with another one from Marjorie Taylor Greene that says, this is a map of the hurricane-affected areas with an overlay of electoral map by political party, which I guess is supposed to maybe like vote by county or something like that, how hurricane devastation could affect the election. So it's her theory that, of course, the hurricane was sent there to suppress the Republican vote in the areas affected. Now, I don't know whether she's got accurate maps of either of those two things, but, you know, she has not got an accurate brain map of how weather works, although it is interesting that, you know, we keep telling them climate change, for instance, is man-made, a man-made phenomenon, and they say, no, it's impossible, that's not the way things work. But you can control the weather. Now, climate's not weather, but I'm just wondering, since they think climate is weather, there's no global warming, here's snow, right? How could it be that, well, okay, nothing works in their brain. But I just wanted to point that out. Their brains are falling apart again. I don't necessarily foresee Marjorie Taylor Greene going down in a hail of bullets or reporting to prison anytime soon, but I don't know. She should be nervous about that and nervous about going out there with weather-controlling tweets when people are ending up in the penitentiary and getting shot. Anyway, one can only hope. So, all right, with that on the record, there's probably more things that I really meant to share with you. And I should thank all the people who sent pre-recorded segments when I didn't know that this thing was going to drop earlier in the week, and I wasn't sure how I was going to handle Thursday. Steve Satig sent some recorded segments. Rosalind McGregor sent us a report on her trip to Washington, D.C. as part of the Sentinels project. And Seth Chipman sent us 2 segments on California water politics, and in fact, I guess difficulties swirling around one of the officials in charge there, who I guess is an actual, you know, by the reports, by the sound of the reports, an actual, you know, reformer, which in California water politics apparently much needed, and as a result has found himself, no pun intended, swimming against the tide and facing all sorts of accusations of wrongdoing that are getting in the way of any of the reform efforts. However, I'm going to have to pocket that. It was a tough day to sit down and, you know, edit things and get them ready for air. Plus, of course, I wanted to return to this remarkable document from Jack Smith, and I'm going to do it. So let's read a little bit, although, you know, I'm wondering also whether there's a little bit more setup that I ought to do, and perhaps, all right, well, with the exciting news of the mental dissolution, and or deaths or being sent to prison of certain QAnon figures, we'll add background here. I have an NBC News piece on the Jack Smith filing, and also a little bit from Empty Wheel, although we can condense what Empty Wheel has to say down to maybe the headline and intro to her piece from the other day. But I'm sure she's combing through this thing piece by piece and giving you all sorts of insight. But I can't do both the filing and her insight and all this other news. But she ran a piece under the headline of John Roberts' Sordid Legacy, 14 pages of mean tweets. The upshot of this, long story short, this one, I think, is that the presidential immunity ruling in Trump v. United States that came out of the Supreme Court, of course, we all recognize as a democracy-threatening, potentially democracy-ending lunacy, has no basis or grounding in any of the legal tradition or constitutional tradition of the United States, period, has resulted in the special counsel having to remind everybody, convince a court that his actions couldn't possibly have been official actions. And one of the methods by which he's had to do it is, look, I'm going to compile a sampling of, this is what Donald Trump spent his time on during this period. 14 pages of mean tweets attacking people who were standing in the way of his overturning the election results, many of whom were members of the Republican Party, which kind of puts an even finer point on it. But this is how dumb the Supreme Court's and how partisan and how corrupt the Supreme Court's ruling was. The special counsel has to spend 14 pages in a filing to a federal judge demonstrating, if you think this has anything to do with official business, you just don't know what the president does, or you don't care. It's really quite remarkable in that sense. So she puts it a little bit better, but I wanted you to know that was out there. I'll share it with you. You can read it because we won't have time. The other one was the NBC News piece, and that one I put aside, I think, also intrigued by the headline. This is the explainer. That's right. Trump claims new Jack Smith filing is election interference. I mentioned that too. And here's how it became public. This is backup for the throwaway mention earlier about how it was Tanya Chutkin and not Jack Smith. Not that will make any difference to Donald Trump, of course. Okay, so that's good. I've got that on record. Let's go back and head back to the filing. You may recall that Section 1 was a sort of recitation of facts that were necessary to demonstrate that the activities leading up to and around January 6th by Donald Trump are not and could not be classified as the sorts of official acts for which a president would be immune from criminal liability, and that some of the activity that would even be presumptively immune, but that there's a rebuttal possibility against the assumption of immunity, he's gonna rebut them, and that he sorted things into categories timeline-wise, and we've gotten up so far to the sort of the hatching of the plot to just overturn the election, just say that he won, regardless, and then the hatching of the plan for the fake electors, launching it first as an idea of these will be contingent on whether or not we win litigation, and then the conversion of the plan once they lost all the litigation into, I don't know, just effing do it. And then up next will be Section E, or subsection E, I don't know what, of Section 1, where we're still laying out the facts. Section 2 then later on is the legal analysis. But I don't know how far we'll get to that. But we're almost at the end of the laying out of the facts. Section E here is the phase of the game where they now start to put pressure on Pence and just say, I tell you what, all of these slates of electors are forgeries and are illegal, but could you please just walk into Congress on January 6th and say, no, they're awesome and we should honor them. That's Section E. The defendant, Donald Trump, again, and I remind you, we're still assembling a roster of all the redacted names, and mostly it's just, they're not really trying to keep them secret, they're just trying to keep the focus on the defendant, I think. Anyway, the defendant, Donald Trump, attempted to persuade Pence to reject votes cast by duly appointed electors and choose the defendant's fraudulent ones. How about a minute or two of this before we exit for the break, just to set the mood for the rest of the show. As the defendant's various attempts to target the states failed and the January 6th congressional certification approached, the defendant and co-conspirators turned their attention to Pence, who, as president of the Senate, presided over the certification proceeding. In service of a new plan to enlist Pence to use his role to fraudulently alter the election results at the January 6th certification proceeding, The defendant and his co-conspirators again used deceit. They lied to Pence, telling him that there was substantial election fraud and concealing their orchestration of the plan to manufacture fraudulent elector slates, at first anyway, as well as their intention to use the fake slates to attempt to obstruct the congressional certification, and they lied to the public, falsely claiming that Pence had the authority during the certification proceeding to reject electoral votes, send them back to the states, or overturn the election, and that Pence agreed that he had these boundless powers. With these lies, the defendant created a tinderbox that he purposely ignited on January 6th. Now it's getting hot, right? The defendant first publicly turned his sights toward January 6th in the early morning hours of December 19th. And by early morning, we don't mean, oh, he's an early riser, he gets up. No, he's still awake. At 1:42 a.m., the defendant posted on Twitter, because of how official his actions were, a copy of a report falsely alleging fraud and wrote, quote, statistically impossible to have lost the 2020 election. Though you know, it did happen right before his very eyes. Big, puffy eyes. Or beady, puffy eyes, really. Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there. We'll be wild. Everyone's heard that one, right? When co-conspirator 5, who I think we now are down to identifying as Ken Cheeseborough, just for the record, learned about the tweet, he sent a link about it to another of the Wisconsin attorneys who had met with the defendant in the Oval Office on December 16th and wrote, wow, based on 3 days ago, I think we have a unique understanding of this. That's understating it. Later, on December 19th, the defendant called Pence and, all right, there's our music. The defendant called Pence and told him of plans for a rally on January 6th. You know, we'll be wild, right? And said that he thought it would be a big day and good to have lots of their supporters in town. Well, and if they were armed, you know, well, so much the better. And then something set them on foot, and insurrection against the laws of the United States, and thereby violating the insurrection statute. Still not charged with that, though. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's jump right back into the recitation from Jack Smith. When we left off, it was Donald Trump telling Mike Pence, not only lying to everybody about what kind of powers he had, but hey, we're going to have this big rally on January 6th, and it'll be good to have lots of supporters in town, to understate things. The defendant and his co-conspirators recognized that Pence, by virtue of his ministerial role presiding over January 6th congressional certification, would need to be a key part of their plan to obstruct the certification proceeding. Which actually is an interesting recognition on their point that we have no official power here. It belongs in Pence's hands. So really, the president's activity can't be official activity. Even he knows he doesn't have the power to do this, that the power lies with someone else. I guess they'll probably be making that argument when they get to the more detailed part, like having a hearing. On December 23rd, in a memorandum drafted with co-conspirator 5, Cheeseborough, and with his assistants, co-conspirator 2, who we now say is John Eastman, outlined a plan for Pence to, gavel in the defendant as the winner. They put gavel in quotes. They do have gavels. But you get the idea. That he's just going to use his authority as presiding officer to just declare it to be so and gavel him in as the winner based on the false claim that, quote, 7 states have transmitted dual slates of electors to the president of the Senate, and proposed that Pence announce that, quote, because of the ongoing disputes in the 7 states, there are no electors that can be deemed validly appointed in those states. Eastman emphasized concealment, writing that, quote, the main thing here, unquote, was that Pence act without, quote, asking for permission, either from a vote of the joint session or from the court. Now, of course, you don't vote in joint session, but that might just be shorthand for asking that there be a vote, dissolving the joint session, sending everybody back to their respective chambers and having them vote there, but also nothing from the court. In other words, 2 or 3 different versions of how Pence could proceed there. Either just declare the alternative slates the real ones and see what happens, or say, well, there's too much confusion, I can't decide, and I also don't have to ask permission from either Congress, over which I'm presiding, or the courts or anyone else to just say that. Eastman's memorandum stood in stark contrast to concessions he had previously made about the vice president's lack of authority in the certification proceeding. 2 months earlier, on October 11th, he had written to a colleague that neither the Constitution nor the Electoral Count Act, ECA, provided the vice president with discretion in the counting of electoral votes or permitted him to, quote, make the determination on his own, unquote. I have some sympathy for somebody like that. I mean, he's reached the wrong conclusion, and this is an extraordinarily quick turnaround. 2 months to go from, no, he doesn't have that power, to, yes, he does. Sometimes over the longer course, basically when you run into walls and obstacles to what it is you want to engineer in a way that you think you have better foundation for, and it doesn't work, sometimes you go grasping for straws. I mean, he shouldn't. This is an overthrow of the government. Maybe he should just give up on it. But certainly, sometimes you see the way facts on the ground are falling in place, or the way the law is interpreted, or whatever precedents are set. I will say, for instance, my own thinking about the propriety of the nuclear option that ended up getting used in the Senate to change interpretations of the filibuster rules, or rather the rules of the Senate that have resulted in the existence of the filibuster as a procedural maneuver. And when it was first threatened by Republicans, in case you've somehow forgotten, back in 2004, 2005, when George W. Bush's most conservative and most controversial judicial appointments were stalled in the Senate thanks to filibusters of those nominations, it was Republicans who said, we can use a majority vote to change the interpretation of filibuster rules such that there won't be any filibuster on judicial nominations and force these people through. And it was kind of a novel feeling concept at that point, even though, as we said, the nuclear option was an existing precedent, not used in this context, judicial nominations, but definitely used to change the interpretation of, or even the actual text of, the rules that created the filibuster. And anyway, at the time, it all felt quite out of keeping with tradition and propriety and legality. But once you examined it closely enough, and then once you realized, the issue is that the Senate gets to decide what its own rules are, and there's really not much opportunity for a constrained court to insert itself. Of course, a crazy court can insert itself in anything, so, maybe not. But once you sort of got to the realization that it was, we are abandoning logic and precedent and just simply doing what we want to do, and depending on the fact that courts to date have been not more than reluctant, they have just refused to intervene on these things on the premise that the constitutional prerogative for setting one's own procedural rules in the legislature is pretty clear. We can't find a way to abrogate that. And once we realized that, we said, well, I guess it's doable. It's just not particularly nice. And then Republicans fell out of power. Shoe went to the other foot, and the answer was, well, you guys said this was legal. You've convinced me that it's doable, if not nice. But, was I opposed to it when you were trying to do it? Yeah. Do I understand it differently because we're in power? Yes. Do I understand it better because I've had time to actually realize, oh, I see. It's not that you were trying to logic your way into it. It's that you were trying to blunt force your way into it, and there really isn't anything that stands in the way of this blunt force after all. Yes. Okay, then. I guess that's the way it's going to be. So sometimes views change, but usually with facts on the ground. For instance, like, no, there's no such thing as presidential immunity. You're an idiot. The way you understand it is like a childlike understanding of presidential power, and maybe a stupid child's understanding of presidential power. Oh, what? The Supreme Court says that exists? Well, nothing I can do about that. I can fight against it, but they did say it exists, and now we have to pretend, if we believe in, judicial precedent and the structure of our courts and the separation of powers, we have to pretend this is real now. And facts change on the ground. No facts changed on the ground, though, for John Eastman between October 11th and December 22nd, except that he was losing the argument over and over again. So, get a new one. Right. So back to the thing. So Eastman's memorandum stood in stark contrast to what he had said 2 months earlier when he had written to a colleague that, no, this power does not lie with the vice president. And just one day earlier, in fact, on December 22nd, when asked by other private attorneys to provide views on a draft complaint that would, if filed, have raised the issue of the vice president's authority on January 6th, Eastman had recommended that the complaint not be filed. He wrote that the risk of getting a court ruling that Pence has no authority to reject the Biden certified ballots is very high. All right, well, that's a different reasoning for not filing, but it was interesting that he chose not to, endorse that filing. But really, he was worried about courts saying, what are you, out of your mind? There's no such thing as this authority. And then that would cause problems for them later on. It wasn't that he believed that there was no such authority necessarily, or that he wasn't willing to say he believed it. His worry was, what if robed authorities say there's no such authority? Then I really have a problem. Then we really have to ask the Supreme Court to just nakedly overturn that. On the evening of December 23rd, after Giuliani shared Eastman and Cheeseborough's plan with the defendant publicly retweeted a document called Operation Pence Card. Get it? Which, like Eastman's memorandum, advocated that Pence block the lawful certification of the legitimate electoral votes. Also on December 23rd. And really, is there anything else going on in December 23rd? Most people are, at office parties or whatever, or watching, Hallmark Christmas movies over and over and over again, let's say. On December 23rd, Eastman emailed Person 42. Do we have an entry for Person 42 yet? No, not yet. Asking to speak to the defendant to update him on our overall strategic thinking. I'm sure there are people out there on social media filling in rosters. Oh, do be careful, though. I have seen a couple of rosters being filled in ways that are kind of inexplicably wrong. Like, it was very obvious to us as we were reading it that, say, the people from about 25 through 30 are all in the Georgia section. They're all Georgia players. And yet I had seen people on social media saying, oh, yeah, that's Enrique Tarrio from the Proud Boys and a few other things. And it was like, well, no, they said this person was a U.S. senator. Enrique Tarrio is not a U.S. senator. Oh, yeah. Gosh, how did I make that? So be careful when you see rosters out there. Double check. See if it makes sense to you. Anyway, so Eastman emails Person 42 and asks to see Trump and update him on all those things. The following day, December 24th, also not a busy period, the defendant called Eastman and they spoke for 40 minutes. Merry Christmas. How you doing? How's the family? Now, overthrow the government, December 24th. If only it had been a silent night. Then on another date following this one, the very next one, I don't know if this is important, but well, check your calendar. See if you're free this year. On December 25th, Cheeseborough proposed in a text message to Eastman, because he hates Jesus and wanted to spend his time doing this instead, and to co-conspirator 6. I don't have a listing for 6. That might end up being Mike Roman, although it's the same problem. Everybody can't tell whether it's Mike Roman or Boris Epstein or whatever, but co-conspirator 6 gets the text message that Pence get the idea that Pence permit an unlimited filibuster of the certification. Sure, why not? In violation of the Electoral Count Act, and ultimately gavel in the defendant as president. Maybe you can get an unlimited filibuster when they split up and go back to the Senate. But again, there's no voting and really not even much debate permitted in the joint session. But again, I guess they're just saying, what if the presiding officer says, yes, we will have debate? If they try to stop him, then they have to debate whether or not he's allowed to stop or keep debate going, and that's still helpful to them. Remember, also, they have this weird childlike understanding that, well, if it has to happen on January 6th, if we can get past midnight so that it's January 7th, doesn't that automatically mean that any certification, even if it happens, of Biden is against the rules, out of keeping with the statutory requirements, and therefore illegal, and he's not president? They were clinging to anything at this point. So, let's see. When Eastman asked, is Pence really likely to be on board with this? Co-conspirator 6 responded, let's keep this off text for now. Because if we do, it'll end up in a special prosecutor's filing before a federal judge. From that point on, the co-conspirators plotted to manipulate Pence. Let's see. Giuliani, Eastman, co-conspirator 6, and Bannon worked in concert to enlist Pence to act unlawfully and to ratchet up public pressure from the defendant's supporters that he do so. Break the law or we'll kill you. They wanted supporters to phone him at his house, I guess, and let him know. But his house was the Naval Observatory, and it was probably a bad idea. The defendant began to directly and repeatedly pressure Pence at the same time that he continued summoning his supporters to a mass in Washington, D.C. on the day of the congressional certification. On Christmas, December 25th, Merry Christmas. They don't say Christmas anymore. They say December 25th. On December 25th, when Pence called the defendant to wish him a Merry Christmas, Pence is ready to do that. The defendant says what? And you too? Happy New Year? No. The defendant raised the certification and told Pence that he had discretion in his role as president of the Senate because Donald Trump hates Christianity, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry. All right. Pence emphatically responded, I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome. And I'm very curious about whether that was, now my mind flipping back to the movies again, to The Martian. Do you think he meant it this way, or do you think he meant it that way? Did he mean, I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome? Or is it, I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome? I'm curious which one it was. Doesn't really matter a great deal, but colors my view of Pence, I suppose. The next day, the defendant tweeted, never give up. See everyone in D.C. on January 6th. He also tweeted false fraud claims like time for Republican senators to step up and fight for the presidency like the Democrats would do if they had actually won. The proof is irrefutable. Massive late-night mail-in ballot drops in swing states, stuffing the ballot boxes on video. Double voters, dead voters, fake signatures, illegal immigrant voters, banned Republican vote watchers, more votes than actual voters. Check out Detroit and Philadelphia and much more. The numbers are far greater than what's necessary to win the individual swing states and cannot even be contested. Courts are bad. The FBI and justice didn't do their job, and the United States election system looks like that of a third world country. Freedom of the press has been gone for a long time. It is fake news, and now we have big tech with Section 230, he says parenthetically, to deal with. But when it is all over, and this period of time, this very short period of time, 2 weeks, becomes just another ugly chapter in our country's history, and it did do that, that's true, we will win. Wow. Well, he's off his rocker. But this is his Christmas message. Just like the Hallmark Channel. It's terrific. On December 28th, okay, so a little bit later, right, Eastman and Cheeseborough and Co-Conspirator 6 exchanged text messages, just like Co-Conspirator 6 said we should stop doing, I want to point out, in which Eastman expressed concern that Gomert v. Pence, a lawsuit filed by that day, before that started, that Pence had discretion to choose electoral votes during the certification proceeding. That would prompt a federal court to publicly reject and thus preclude the plan that the conspirators were advancing in private. Whoops. Louis Gohmert was dumb and didn't know how to, properly be a team player. I can't believe it. Thereafter, at 11 a.m. on January 1st, again, anybody busy? The defendant called Pence. Happy New Year, Mike. No. The defendant called Pence to berate him because he had learned that Pence had filed a brief opposing the relief sought in Gohmert. He's being sued by Gohmert. He replies to the suit on January 1st, right in the middle of everything, or I guess a little bit earlier. And then Trump calls to yell at him, you got sued and you answered, I'll have you killed. He's not reached that stage yet. But anyway, when Pence explained, as he had before, that he did not believe that he had the power under the Constitution to decide which votes to accept, the defendant told him that, quote, hundreds of thousands of people are going to hate your guts. And these are quotes because I'm doing them in Trump voices. So, it's true. People are going to think you're stupid. And berated him pointedly. You're too honest. I've heard that one before, but oh my God. People are going to think you're stupid because of how honest you are. Immediately before the call, the defendant had spoken separately to Giuliani from 10:06 a.m. to 10:14 a.m. Could be watching the Mummers Parade, but no. Even a Super Bowl or who knows what. Not Super Bowl, but bowl games, college bowl games. Anyway, he also calls Bannon from 10:36 to 10:46 a.m. I'd wonder if I had died and gone to hell if my January 1st is calling Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon. And late that afternoon, the defendant spoke separately with Bannon, Eastman, and Giuliani. Okay, so it's the same cast of characters. He speaks to them a lot. Spends his whole January 1st on the phone with them. Within hours of the call to Pence, the defendant reminded supporters to travel to Washington for the certification proceeding, tweeting, the big protest rally in Washington, D.C. will take place at 11 a.m. on January 6th. Locational details to follow. Stop the steal! But he forgot the hashtag. But he did make it all one word. Stop the steal. The next day, January 2nd, Giuliani, Eastman, and Co-Conspirator 6 appeared on Bannon's podcast when Bannon asked whether the January 6th certification would be, quote, a climactic battle. Co-Conspirator 2, that's Eastman, responded that a lot of that depends on the courage and the spine of the individuals involved. The defendant spoke to Giuliani shortly after his appearance on the podcast. That afternoon, Co-Conspirator 6 worked to arrange a meeting among the defendant, Eastman, and Pence in order to enlist Pence to misuse his role as president of the Senate at the certification proceeding. When Co-Conspirator 6 texted Bannon about the meeting, Bannon, who had just finished a phone call with the defendant, reiterated that the defendant wanted Pence, quote, briefed by Eastman immediately. Thereafter, the defendant called Pence, informing him that he had spent the day speaking to a Secretary of State, state legislators, and members of Congress. Yeah, so, as described earlier in this filing, the defendant spoke with Georgia Secretary of State Brett Raffensperger the same day, person 33. On the call with Pence, the defendant said he had learned that a U.S. senator was going to propose a 10-day delay in the certification proceeding and told Pence, you can make the decision. to delay the count for 10 days. The defendant then referred Pence to Eastman for the first time and asked if Pence would meet with him. On January 3rd, the defendant again told Pence that at the certification proceeding, Pence had the absolute right to reject electoral votes and the ability to overturn the election. Pence responded that he had no such authority and that a federal appeals court had rejected a lawsuit making that claim the previous day, the one that he was, yelled at for responding to. Then the defendant took to Twitter again to falsely claim that fraud had permeated the election. Sorry, but the number of votes in the swing states that we are talking about is very large and totally outcome determinative, he learned a phrase. Only the Democrats and some rhinos would dare dispute this, even though they know it is true. The same day, Eastman circulated a second memorandum that included a new plan under which, in violation of the ECA, the vice president would send the elector slates to the state legislatures to determine which slate to count. Mind you, no state legislator at this point has actually agreed to do this, and none of them ever would. But that's still the plan. The meeting that co-conspirator 6 had organized so that the defendant and Eastman could enlist Pence to reject Biden's legitimate electoral votes was scheduled late in the afternoon of January 4th. In advance of the meeting, Giuliani, Eastman, co-conspirator 6, and Bannon gathered at the Willard Hotel near the White House, and from there, remember that was the war room on January 6th that day, and from there, Giuliani called and spoke with the defendant. When Eastman arrived at the White House for the meeting, person 9... that's Eric Hirschman, we still think, confronted Eastman about the legal basis for his proposal. Hirschman went line by line through Eastman's second memo, and Eastman conceded that no court would support it. That's a good filing then, isn't it? In response, and I mean, it is interesting that they still continue to do it. They know that no court would support it, but it's kind of astonishing. They must at that point know, we think we've rigged up the Supreme Court pretty well. We think that we have at least 5 votes to just do whatever the F we say the law now is and overturn 250 years of understanding of the basis of the Constitution and American democracy and just get our way. So anyway, Hirschman warned Eastman that pressing his admittedly unlawful plan would cause, quote, riots in the streets. I don't know whether this is what follows, but I mean, what we know is happening in Trump's head is, ours, and we're going to win them. Hirschman, and I do have that right, isn't it? Yeah, Hirschman. Hirschman then spoke to the defendant, telling him that the theory that Eastman and others were promoting would not work, and that Eastman had acknowledged that it was not going to work. The defendant responded, other people disagree, but did not identify those other people. It's him. Hirschman also pointed out that to the defendant that Eastman's theory regarding a strategic Democratic plan to subvert the election was inconsistent with other allegations that have been floating around about Company 3, we think that's Dominion, voting system, and foreign interference. The meeting among the defendant, Eastman, Pence, and Pence staffers, person 8 and person 58, and we think person 8, is Mark Short, his chief of staff. Person 58, Greg Jacob, maybe his chief counsel, began around 4:45 p.m. No one from the defendant's White House counsel's office attended, because they all thought that this was garbage. During the meeting, the defendant asked Eastman to explain his plan to Pence. I'm only the president of the United States. I can't get my hand around it. Eastman presented 2 options. Pence could unilaterally decide objections to electors, or alternatively, if you're scared of that, in the plan that Eastman had devised the prior day, Pence could send the elector slates to the targeted state legislatures to determine which electors' votes should be counted, even though there was, the governor's signature on one and not on the other. But could you just pretend that isn't the case, or that you don't care? That was the plan. Why doesn't somebody else do it? If the in the defendant's presence, in response to Pence's questioning, Eastman admitted that the ECA forbade what he proposed, and that no one had tested his new plan to send the elector slates to the state legislatures for review. He made it up, but he figured, if you order it, they'll do it. Nonetheless, the defendant repeatedly expressed a preference that Pence unilaterally reject valid elector slates. I don't know what these state legislatures are going to do, and I do know that they keep refusing to do it. So I would just prefer if you just decided that and pounded the gavel and said it was true. Throughout the meeting, the defendant repeated his knowingly false fraud claims as a purported basis for Pence to act illegally. Pence's 5 pages of contemporaneous notes from the meeting reflect that the defendant said, quote, "When there's fraud, the rules get changed. Bottom line, we won every state by hundreds of thousands of votes. This whole thing is up to MP Mike Pence." And Pence has to do with you. You can be bold and, quote, right to do whatever you want to do. Although, this is why Pence's notes about what Trump said. So maybe the voice isn't warranted. I don't know. The meeting concluded with Pence firm and clear telling the defendant, these are his notes, but I'm not seeing this argument working. Nonetheless, the defendant requested that Pence's staff meet with Eastman again to discuss further, and Pence agreed. All right. Well, I guess he thought he was probably getting the inkling early on that he was in trouble and under threat. The conspirators were undeterred. Immediately after leaving the White House, Eastman gathered with co-conspirator 6 and Bannon back at the Willard Hotel. Over the days that followed, these co-conspirators strategized how Eastman could influence Pence through the vice president's counsel and normalized the unlawful plan by discussing it on Bannon's podcast. Meanwhile, the defendant continued to pressure Pence publicly. Okay, so we're getting back to music time for another break. I'll read a little bit more here. For his part, immediately upon leaving the meeting with Pence, the defendant traveled to Dalton, Georgia. The obvious location, the obvious destination, to speak at a political rally at the invitation of the 2 U.S. senators engaged in runoff elections there. During his political speech, the defendant promoted many of these same falsehoods that he previously had been informed were untrue. He said, "They're not taking the White House. We're going to fight like hell, I'll tell you right now," and remarked, "I hope Mike Pence comes through for us. I have to tell you, I hope that our great vice president comes through." All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We were in the middle, and we're still in the middle of reading Jack Smith's momentous motion to Judge Tanya Chutkan in opposition to, it's not styled in opposition to, but it is in opposition to Trump's claims of immunity. As astonishing as this recitation is, and as obvious as it should be on its face that there's no such thing as immunity in this, certainly under these circumstances, for Donald Trump, and ought not to be. Remember that he is presenting this briefing because the Supreme Court, having heard these arguments and heard this recitation of facts or something nearly, so nearly akin to it, that it feels like a lot of this was already known, even though this compilation is pretty remarkable by itself, still ruled 6-3 in the face of everything. Yeah, maybe he should be immune from this prosecution for doing this stuff. All he's doing is undermining, 250 years of the understanding of the operation of the Constitution. Is that really so bad? All right. But not only were we in the middle of that, we were in the middle of reciting Trump's threats and cajolement. I got cajolement, a thing. Cajoling of Pence into believing, hopefully into believing that he could do these things, even though Pence was dead set against it. So again, he's at a political rally as the leader of the political party at this point. This is not an official duty of the president. He's down there campaigning for the 2 U.S. senators who were eventually defeated in their runoffs, and in his speech saying, they're not taking the White House, we're going to fight like hell, all of that. And then the repetitive, just running around in circles about Mike Pence here. I guess he's mulling in his head, can I say that we should kill Mike Pence? Probably not. That's probably not the wisest move. So I'm just going to do the whole movie mob boss fake, I hope he understands, nice vice presidency you got there. It'd be a shame if anything were to happen to it, right? I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. Thank you for clarifying, by the way, by saying that twice. Of course, Johnny 2 times here. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much. That's his Fat Tony impression there. He also used the Dalton campaign speech as a call to action to his own supporters, telling the crowd that if you don't fight to save your country with everything you have, you're not going to have a country left. Something we heard again on January 6th, and demanded that his supporters take action to prevent what he falsely called the outright stealing of elections, because every Republican accusation is a confession, like they're trying to do with us. No, that's you. Sorry. Emphasizing, of course, we can't let that happen. The next morning, January 5th, the defendant spoke on the phone with Bannon. Less than 2 hours later on his podcast, Bannon said in anticipation of the January 6th certification proceeding, all hell is going to break loose tomorrow. What do you know? It did. On the morning of January 5th, Eastman participated in a federal court hearing in Trump v. Kemp, the Georgia lawsuit against person 17, who is Brian Kemp, of course, and Brad Raffensperger, person 33, in which the defendant had signed a false verification days earlier. Remember that? Everybody knew it was false. Please don't have him sign another one because he's going to get himself in trouble. Oh, he signed it again. Damn. Eastman, on the defendant's behalf, asked the federal court to decertify the presidential election in Georgia, not something they've ever done before, and declare that the state legislature may choose the state's electors. During the hearing, the federal court denied the relief requested. It's dumb. No one ever does that. Get lost. Immediately following the federal court's rejection of the legal basis for the conspirators' plan, whoops, what do we do now, Mr. Lawyer? Eastman went to the meeting that the defendant had requested that Pence's staff, Greg Jacob and person 8, Mark Short, take. Jacob is person 58 here. At the outset, Eastman changed his tack. He just got faced in federal court. So what does he say? He advocated now that Pence simply reject the Biden electors outright. Just forget sending them to the states. Just say, nope, this fake certificate with no seal, no signature from the governor, no signature from the Secretary of State, not even letterhead, nothing. No, it's not on parchment. It's a Word document. I can still edit it. They didn't even make it a PDF, whatever, right? Just reject the Biden electors outright. This, by the way, he should have just gone in and said, you know what? I'm reading this document from Georgia, and it's weird. They say the electors are voting for Mike Pence, not Donald Trump. Wouldn't that have been something? Sure, go ahead and try it. But okay, he didn't. Immediately following the court's rejection, Eastman changes this to this tactic. At the outset, Eastman changed his tack and said, just reject the Biden electors. This was contrary to his primary recommendation the day before for Pence to send the slates to the state legislatures, but consistent with the preference that the defendant had expressed. And he's a genius, so we might as well do his plan. Eastman made additional concessions during the meeting. For example, Eastman agreed that the Supreme Court would unanimously reject his proposed action. Consistent historical practice since the founding. Wow. Was that the vice president never asserted authority to reject electors. No reasonable person would want the Constitution read that way because the office would never switch political parties. So state legislatures appeared poised to try to change its electors, and if Democrats... no state legislature appeared poised to change its electors, and if Democrats were to claim the same authority, Eastman would not credit it. Well, that seems like a reason not to listen to him. However, they were insisting that they do anyway. Greg Jacob expressed to Eastman that the defendant's plan would result in a disastrous situation where the election might have to be decided in the streets. Having failed to enlist Jacob in the criminal conspiracy, Eastman told him that the quote, team was going to be, quote, really disappointed. That's some mobster threat there. The team, in fact, was disappointed. After Eastman updated Giuliani on the meeting, co-conspirator 6 confirmed to Bannon that the Pence lawyer, that is, Greg Jacob, was, quote, totally against us, prompting Bannon to respond, F his lawyer. How do you like that? Yeah, well, my response is, his lawyer. That same day, Eastman received an email confirming what he had already admitted to Greg Jacob, that no chamber of any legislature in any state, including Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, was requesting that its electoral votes be returned to the state for review. Meanwhile, Chesebro, who had traveled to Washington as directed by the defendant's public messages, i.e., gonna be wild. That's actually what dragged Ken Chesebro there. Not like, well, we'd like to have a meeting of the lawyers who came up with this plan and strategize for the day. He was responding to the public tweets from Trump. Be there, we'll be wild. Because he did, in fact, go to the Capitol that day. He pretends to just be a lawyer and all this, but he went with the rioters. And here's what happens. Meanwhile, Chesebro, who had traveled to Washington, obtained duplicate originals of the fraudulent certificates. Make sure you make extra copies of the fraud. Signed by the defendant's fraudulent electors in Michigan and Wisconsin, which they believed had not been delivered by mail to the President of the Senate or the archivist, which is, of course, what the Electoral Count Act requires, and hand-delivering them with fake, signatures on them through some lawyers for the campaign isn't really, contemplated as a valid service of these things. But what the hell? We got to get him to Pence somehow if we want him to fake this stuff, even though he says he's not going to do it. Chesebro received these duplicates from campaign staff and surrogates, so definitely very unofficial, who flew them to Washington at private expense. He then hand-delivered them to staffers. Whose staffers? Staffers for a U.S. representative. Not the vice president of the United States, not the president of the Senate, but a guy in the House. But he did it at the Capitol as part of a plan to deliver them to Pence for use in the certification proceeding. And you may recall when people were wargaming, how could he overturn the election? How could he sow chaos? As early as October of 2020, which, by the way, is now 4 years prior. We're reaching the anniversary of that point. Right now we're in National Trolley Problem Awareness Week, memorializing the failure of the trolley problem by the doctors at Walter Reed, because Trump is now reporting to the hospital and on the verge of being put on a ventilator. But later on, people are gaming out. By October 2020, we know that there's the possibility that Trump just calls for chaos in Congress and maybe chaos on the streets and tries to reverse this stuff. And even, I think, fake electors are posited, because we're already at this point in 2020 positing. The real problem is they can fake these certificates up, but how do they get them onto the floor of the House for the joint session? Because there are, actual honest clerks in the way. The clerk of the House is controlled by Democrats. She is not going to put fake elector certificates in the hands of the vice president. They're not. So how are they going to? They're going to have to smuggle certificates in that are A, obviously fake on their face, and B, have to be smuggled into there. And indeed, that's their plan. We are going to smuggle them in there. It was really kind of bold, I suppose, in a way. The defendant, the recitation continues, did not leave the pressure campaign to his co-conspirators. He redoubled his own efforts. And he's a lazy guy, so that's pretty amazing. On January 5th at 11:06 a.m., shortly before Eastman's meeting with Greg Jacob, the defendant tweeted, all he has to do is tweet. No wonder he's up for that. The vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors and designate the defendant as the winner of the Electoral College vote. That afternoon, the defendant met privately with Pence in the Oval Office, probably threw ketchup at him, During the meeting, the defendant once again told Pence, I think you have the power to decertify. This is, by the way, the moving goalposts all over the place. Send it back to the states, declare it yourself, decertify the ones that are real. When Pence was unmoved, the defendant threatened to criticize him publicly. That's the most dangerous thing for anybody, I guess. I'm going to have to say that you did a great disservice. This concerned person 8, that's Mark Short, to whom Pence had relayed the defendant's threat, and it is a threat, to the point that he alerted Pence's Secret Service detail. Next still, is that right? Next still, the defendant initiated a phone call with Pence. And also on the phone call, Mark Short, Greg Jacob, and Eastman, and one or two other private attorneys, likely including Giuliani, and again, raised the scenario of the vice president sending the elector slates to state legislatures. Greg Jacob again pointed out that such a strategy violated the Electoral Count Act, and Pence reaffirmed that he did not believe he had the authority to do so. Shortly after the call that evening at 5:43 p.m., defendant tweeted, I will be speaking at the Save America rally tomorrow at the Ellipse at 11 a.m. Eastern. Arrive early. Doors, it's an outdoor rally. Doors open at 7 a.m. Eastern. Big crowds. The defendant continued his pressure campaign on Pence that evening. After a New York Times article that night detailed the afternoon's private conversation in which Pence had rejected the defendant's demand to act unlawfully, it's in the New York Times already. The defendant directed person 4, and I think I didn't do this identification, but I think we took it from somebody that looked like they had a handle on things. Person 4 here, Jason Miller. Yeah, the rapist guy. One of dozens of rapists on the Trump campaign. Anyway, but he's the one that likes to slip people roofies and then slip them abortion drugs afterwards. He's a great guy. Defendant directed Jason Miller to issue a statement rebutting it, the New York Times article, and approved the statement at 9:28 p.m. Minutes later, the defendant called Pence and told him, you gotta be tough tomorrow. After concluding the call with Pence, the defendant sequentially spoke to Bannon, followed by Eastman. Then, at around 10 p.m. that night, the defendant issued a public statement which read, the vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act. A statement that the defendant knew was a lie from Pence's repeated and firm rejections of his efforts, but that gave false hope to the defendant's supporters arriving in the city at the defendant's request and maximized pressure on Pence. Now on to Section F here, and F this section. The defendant caused unlawful conduct on January 6th and tried to take advantage of the riot that ensued. Yeah, here's where it gets really hairy. The defendant continued his intense pressure campaign against the vice president into the early morning hours of January 6th. Around 1 a.m., because, why get any sleep, the defendant tweeted falsely, if Vice President Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. We will steal the presidency, really, but many states want to decertify the mistake. Many people are saying this. Many states want to decertify the mistake they made in certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in a process not approved by their state legislatures, which it must be, he puts parenthetically. Mike can send it back. At 8:17 a.m., as the supporters he summoned to the city gathered near the White House, the defendant, again, falsely tweeted about the certification. States want to correct their votes. No state wanted to do it, by the way, which they now know were based on irregularities and fraud, plus corrupt process, never received legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage. Or extreme crime, whichever it may be. Later that morning, Ken Cheeseborough worked with another attorney for the defendant who contacted a U.S. senator to ask him to obtain the fraudulent Wisconsin and Michigan documents from the U.S. Representative's office and hand deliver them to the vice president. I think that's Ron Johnson, the senator we're talking about. And I forget which, is it Scott Perry maybe? The U.S. representative? I can't recall. He had a huge role in things, but I don't remember whether it was him they handed the thing off to, but I do remember it was Ron Johnson. When one of the U.S. Senator's staffers contacted a Pence staffer by text message to arrange for the delivery of what the U.S. Senator's staffer had been told were, quote, alternative slates of electors for Michigan and Wisconsin because the archivist didn't receive them because they're fraud, they're forgeries, Pence's staffer rejected them. It's funny, though. Johnson has no idea at this point that Pence is, not on board. At 11:15 a.m., shortly before traveling to the Ellipse to speak to his supporters, the defendant called Pence and made one last attempt to induce him to act unlawfully in the upcoming session. It's now 45 minutes away, I guess, this session of Congress. When Pence again refused and told the defendant that he intended to make a statement to Congress before the certification proceeding, confirming that he lacked the authority to do what the defendant wanted, the defendant was incensed. He decided to reinsert into his campaign speech at the Ellipse remarks targeting Pence for his refusal to misuse his role in the certification, and the defendant set into motion the last plan in furtherance of his conspiracies. If Pence would not do as he asked, the defendant needed to find another way to prevent the certification of Biden as president. So on January 6th, the defendant sent to the Capitol, one might say set on foot toward the Capitol, a crowd of angry supporters whom the defendant had called to the city and inundated with false claims of outcome-determinative election fraud to induce Pence not to certify the legitimate electoral votes and to obstruct the certification. At the Ellipse campaign rally, they have to call it that because, of course, it is not an official act, just reminding the SCOTUS of what's going on here. Giuliani and Eastman both spoke just before the defendant. And really, was there any reason in the world why anybody wanted to hear from John Eastman? No one knew who he was at that point. In his rally speech, Giuliani sought to cloak the conspiracies in an air of legitimacy, assuring the defendant's supporters that every single thing has been outlined as the plan for today is perfectly legal, which is why you're all getting arrested, and some of you dying in a hail of gunfire in your foreclosed homes, and introducing Eastman as a, quote, preeminent constitutional scholar who would further explain this plan. He falsely claimed that legislatures in 5 states were, quote, begging, that's Giuliani speak for begging, to have their electoral ballots returned. Everyone was afraid of it. No one wanted anything to do with it, but they're all begging for it. Giuliani then asserted that Pence could, quote, decide on the validity of these crooked ballots and told the crowd, let's have trial by combat. Oh boy. Co-conspirator 2, that's Eastman, in his speech, claimed that Pence must send electoral votes to state legislatures for the American people to know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not, and decried that, quote, we no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get the answer to this question, unquote. I don't really know what Eastman sounds like. Can't make fun of his voice. When the defendant took the stage at the Ellipse to speak to the supporters who had gathered there at his urging, he knew that Pence had refused once and for all to use the defendant's fraudulent electors' certificates. The defendant also knew that he had only one last hope to prevent Biden's certification as president, the large and angry crowd standing in front of him. And reminder, he wanted the metal detectors removed because he knew that people were armed, but they weren't there to hurt him. So it was okay. So for more than an hour, the defendant delivered a speech designed to inflame his supporters and motivate them to march to the Capitol, to set them on foot. I keep adding that. The defendant told his crowd many of the same lies he had been telling for months, publicly and privately, including to the officials in the targeted states, and that he knew were not true. In Arizona, he claimed more than 36,000 ballots had been cast by non-citizens. Regarding Georgia, the defendant repeated the falsehood that more than 10,300 dead people voted. You remember Brad Raffensperger told him 2? Just 2, not 2,000. 2. And he raised the publicly disproven claims about fraud by election workers at State Farm Arena. He made baseless allegations of dead voters in Nevada and Michigan and false claims about illegally counted votes in Wisconsin. And in Pennsylvania, he claimed that there were hundreds of thousands more ballots counted than there had even been voters. The defendant also lied to his rally supporters when he claimed that certain states wanted to reconsider or recertify their duly appointed electors. For instance, he said, by the way, Pennsylvania has now seen all of this. They didn't know because it was so quick. They had a vote. They voted. No, they didn't. But now they see all this stuff. It's all come to light. Oh, they had a vote before they knew. Okay, I see. Doesn't happen that fast. And they want to recertify their votes. They want to recertify. But the only way that can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. Why? Why don't they come down and beat up Mike Pence and take him? How come they're not here? Mike Pence has to agree to send it back. In response to this lie about Pennsylvania, the defendant's crowd began to chant, send it back, send it back. The defendant gave his supporters false hope that Pence would take action to change the results of the election and claimed that Pence had the authority to do so. He falsely told the crowd that Pence could still, quote, do the right thing and halt the certification, and he extemporized lines about the vice president through the speech, including the indirect threat, Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country, and if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I will tell you right now, I'm not hearing good stories. Although you just told us that you were hearing good stories. But hey, whatever. The defendant galvanized his supporters by painting the stakes as critical and assuring them that history was going to be made. He made clear that he expected his supporters to take action, telling them regarding his loss of the election that we're not going to let that happen, calling on them to fight and to take back their country through strength, while suggesting that legal means were antiquated or insufficient to remedy the purported fraud because when you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. You are, of course, not, and we have, of course, caught you many times, and if we went by those very different rules, you would share your fate with Nicolae Ceausescu, and, well, you know, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. Throughout the speech, from as early as about 15 minutes into it, and twice in its final lines, the defendant directed his supporters to go to the Capitol. They were set on foot toward the Capitol and suggested that he would go with them. The overall impact of the defendant's speech, particularly in light of months of statements and tweets falsely claiming election fraud and following on the heels of Giuliani and Eastman's speeches, were to fuel the crowd's anger. For instance, when the defendant told his supporters that we will not let them silence your voices, we're not going to let it happen, the crowd chanted, fight for Trump in response. When the defendant soon after told supporters, we're going to walk down to the Capitol, that they would never take back our country with weakness, and that they had to show strength and had to be strong, members of the crowd shouted, invade the Capitol building and take the Capitol. Well, if you set that on foot, that's insurrection. Thousands of the defendant's supporters obeyed his directive and marched to the Capitol, where the certification proceeding began around 1 p.m. Oh, I think I had thought it was noon. So it wasn't 45 minutes before, but an hour and 45 minutes before. Just to correct that for the record, minutes earlier, Pence had issued a public statement explaining that his role as president of the Senate did not include, quote, unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not. On the floor of the House of Representatives, Pence opened the certificates of vote and certificates of ascertainment from Arizona, consistent with the Electoral Count Act. After an objection from a senator and a representative, the House and Senate retired to their separate chambers to debate it. Outside of the Capitol building, a mass of people, including those who had traveled to Washington and the Capitol at the defendant's direction, broke through barriers cordoning off the Capitol grounds and advanced on the building. Among these was Co-Conspirator 5, Ken Cheeseborough, the lawyer, who had attended the defendant's speech from the Washington Monument, marched with the crowd to the Capitol, and breached the restricted area surrounding the building. He wasn't even just doing it in a nice suit from the Willard Hotel. He joined the crowd. Amazing. A large portion of the crowd at the Capitol, including rioters who violently attacked law enforcement officers trying to secure the building, wore clothing and carried items bearing the defendant's name and campaign slogans, leaving no doubt that they were there on his behalf and at his direction. Not that that stopped them from claiming, no, they're actually Antifa in disguise. You remember that, don't you? All right. Beginning at about 1:30 p.m., the defendant settled into the dining room off of the Oval Office, the command center, right? Barack Obama, Joe Biden, right? They go down to the situation room in the secure basement of the White House to take care of things like that. He goes to the dining room. Give me ketchup. I want hamburgers. All right, sure. So at 1:30, he goes to the dining room off the Oval Office. He spent the afternoon there, reviewing Twitter on his phone while the dining room television played Fox News' contemporaneous coverage of events at the Capitol. You know that sad story. We'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Net Roots Radio. We got one last stretch to try to get through as much of this motion as possible. I do hope we're doing you a service in getting this all on the record. I mean, most of this is facts that we've gleaned over the years and we know in the back of our heads, and we could probably reconstruct most of the narrative. It is useful, I hope, to have it all in one place. And there are, I think, a few bits of news in this. And by the way, Bill Barr, no, not that Bill Barr, but the Bill Barr who we like because he's one of us and a listener to the show, notes, gives me the reaffirmation I need to subject you to more of the Rudy Giuliani talk. It's not nearly as close to the way Giuliani, I think, really talks, but as the Donald Trump one, although the Donald Trump one, you could tell the difference between me and him, I think. But I don't know. So now it just means you're going to get more of the same. I like the voices. I wish I had more voices to add to it. Steve Bannon doesn't have a particularly distinctive voice, but when you do, you're going to hear it here in the reenactment. Okay, so where were we? Oh, yes. Right. All right, he's sent everybody there. They're all wearing pro-Trump stuff. He's ensconced in the dining room throwing ketchup and watching Fox News and tweeting because of how official all of his activities are that day, right? At 2:13 p.m., the crowd at the Capitol broke into the building. I used to think you would get killed immediately when you do that, but no, guess not. And forced the Senate to recess. Within minutes, I mean, that's an understatement, but within minutes, staffers fled the Senate chamber. In fact, senators fled the Senate chamber. We have Josh Hawley fleeing on security camera, carrying the legitimate electors' physical certificates of vote and certificates of ascertainment. Right? It's a break-in. Staffers have to save the real. Now, we've told you that there are, of course, copies elsewhere. But that's not really the point. The point is that you actually had to rescue these things because people were going to come in and try and grab them and steal them and burn them, even though that would be ineffectual. But, it would also be just amazingly, outrageously insurrection-y, I guess. But didn't happen thanks to the quick action from the Senate staffers. Why risk losing the certificates that even your insurrectionist enemies are the ones think are the ones that count. I suppose if they think they're that persuasive, it's worth saving them. Anyway, next to the Senate chamber, a group of rioters chased a U.S. Capitol police officer up a flight of stairs to within 40 feet of where Pence was sheltering with his family. As they did so, the rioters shouted at the officer in search of public officials, "Where the F they at? Where the F they counting the votes at? Why are you protecting them? You're a effing traitor." On the other side of the Capitol, the House was also forced to recess. And, of course, they were forced to recess, barricade the doors with furniture, and Capitol police officers to draw their pistols and point them at the windows of the barricaded doors in case they had to shoot rioters coming through to capture, kill, maim, or otherwise threaten members of Congress who were trapped in the chamber. Wow. Fox News' coverage of the events at the Capitol included, at about 2:12 p.m., reports of the Capitol being on lockdown and showed video footage of large crowds within the restricted area surrounding the Capitol. Much of the crowd was wearing clothing and carrying flags evidencing their allegiance to the defendant. Again, important because of their claims of who those people were when they were caught red-handed doing this. And, of course, the reminder that this is what's on Fox News' coverage is meant to convey. Remember, at this point, Mr. Official President is in the lunchroom watching this coverage. This is his only input and window into what's actually happening, and he's watching approvingly. At about 2:20 p.m., videos of crowds on the Capitol lawn and West Terrace were shown alongside a chyron stating, "Certification vote paused as protests erupt on Capitol Hill." At 2:21 p.m., an on-the-street reporter interviewed an individual marching from the Ellipse to the Capitol who claimed to have come to Washington, quote, "because President Trump told us we had something big to look forward to, and I believed that Vice President Pence was going to certify the electoral votes or not certify them, but I guess that just changed, correct? And it's a very big disappointment, and I think there's several 100,000 people here who are very disappointed. But I still believe President Trump has something else left." That's the quote from the person on the street marching to the Capitol. And at approximately 2:24 p.m., Fox News reported that a police officer may have been injured and that protesters have made their way inside the Capitol. At 2:24 p.m., Trump was alone in his dining room when he issued a tweet attacking Pence and fueling the ongoing riot. "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones, which way they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth." That afternoon at the Capitol, a rioter used a bullhorn to read the defendant's tweet about the vice president aloud to the crowd trying to gain entry to the building. The defendant issued the incendiary tweet about Pence despite knowing, as he would later admit in an interview in 2023, that his supporters, quote, listened to him like no one else. Certainly sounds like him. 1 minute later, at 2:25 p.m., the Secret Service was forced to evacuate Pence to a secure location at the Capitol. Throughout the afternoon, members of the crowd chanted, "Hang Mike Pence! Where is Pence? Bring him out!" and "Traitor Pence!" Several rioters in those chanting crowds wore hats and carried flags, evidencing their allegiance to the defendant. In the years since January 6th, the defendant has refused to take responsibility for putting Pence in danger, instead blaming Pence. On March 13th, 2023, he said, "Had Mike Pence sent the votes back to the legislatures, they wouldn't have had a problem with January 6th. So in many ways, you can blame him for January 6th. Had he sent them back to Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, the states, I believe, number one, you would have had a different outcome. But I also believe you wouldn't have had January 6th, as we call it." Rioters, again, many bearing pro-Trump paraphernalia indicating their allegiance, breached the Senate chamber, rifled through the papers of the senators' desks, and stood on the dais where Pence had been presiding just minutes earlier. On the House side, rioters watched as police evacuated lawmakers from the House chamber, smashing glass windows surrounding a locked door that stood between them and the fleeing members and staffers. At least one rioter recorded video showing members being evacuated while the growing crowd screamed at the Capitol Police officers guarding the locked door to the House Speaker's lobby. Some of the worst violence of the day took place outside of the Capitol on the lower west terrace, the side of the building facing the ellipse where the defendant had given his speech. There, scaffolding placed in anticipation of the January 20th inauguration created a tunnel leading to a set of double glass doors into the center of the Capitol building. After rioters had forced their way onto restricted Capitol grounds and past the temporary barriers, including layers of snow fencing and bike racks, they attacked the law enforcement officers trying to protect the building with flagpoles, bear spray, stolen police riot shields, and other improvised weapons. Of his time defending the Capitol, one Metropolitan Police Department officer said, quote, "I feared for my life." Well, you know what it means when a cop says that, but yet nobody got shot except Ashley Babbitt inside. But I feared for my life from the moment I got into that. We were walking into the crowd when the Capitol police officer was leading us to the front line, and especially when I got sprayed in the middle of the crowd. At that point, honestly, I thought, this is it. Yeah, multiple times. You know, you're getting pushed, kicked, you know, people are throwing metal bats at you and all that stuff. I was like, yeah, this is effing it. And just for the record here, this is a Metropolitan Police Department officer, Washington, D.C. cop, not Capitol Police. This is Washington, D.C. cops being called in to back up the Capitol Police during the attack. The officer described that the rioters he encountered at the Capitol were wearing both tactical gear and Trump paraphernalia and appeared to be acting out of, quote, pure, sheer anger. How did that happen? In the years after January 6th, the defendant has reiterated his support for and allegiance to rioters who broke into the Capitol, calling them patriots and hostages. A little bit like what Tina Peters thought was true of her. I'm a patriot. I'm a hero. You're no hero. You're a charlatan who abused the power of his office, and you're going in. Well, he also provided them with financial assistance. I'm sure very limited. It was really mostly he hosted fundraisers for them at Pervalago and charged them for the privilege of using the Pervalago ballroom for it. So he made money off them. I don't know how much financial assistance they really got, but okay. And, of course, what else has he done? Reminiscing about January 6th as a beautiful day because of his great vocabulary. At a rally in Waco, Texas, all the good things that happen in Waco, Texas. You know, on March 25th, 2023, sorry to Blue Waco. Anyway, the defendant started a tradition that he has repeated several times, opening the event with a song called Justice for All, recorded by a group of charged, and in many cases convicted, January 6th offenders, known as the January 6th Choir. That they're even free to do this, that he's even alive to see this happen, is astounding in the history of the world. Usually lose a coup like this, they're not around to record We Are the World for profit. Anyway, the January 6th Choir sang this, and who, because of their dangerousness, are held at the District of Columbia jail. At the Waco rally of the January 6th Choir, the defendant said, "Our people love those people. They love those people." I love it. He's said everything twice. Once more, Donnie 2 times on this. The defendant has also stated that if reelected, he will pardon individuals convicted of crimes on January 6th. I'm sure including himself, because we're reading a motion in the attempt to get to the criminal trial of Donald Trump for his actions on January 6th. He's going to be among the January 6th convicted if we actually get justice in any of this. On the evening of January 6th, the defendant and Giuliani attempted to exploit the violence and chaos at the Capitol by having Giuliani call senators and attempt to get them to further delay the certification. Oh, this reminds me of what's coming here. Around 7 p.m., Giuliani placed calls to 5 U.S. senators and 1 U.S. representative. Co-conspirator 6 attempted to confirm phone numbers for a member of Congress whom the defendant directed Giuliani to call. In a voicemail that Giuliani intended for one senator, Giuliani said, "I'm calling you because I want to discuss with you how they're trying to rush this hearing and how we need you." And there's no hearing going on, by the way. We need you, our Republican friends, to try to just slow it down so we can get these legislatures more information. Get more information to you. He wants to, that's a different play, actually, isn't it? Slow it down so we can get these legislatures to get more information to you. And I know they're reconvening at 8 tonight, but the only strategy we can follow is to object to numerous states and raise issues so that we can get ourselves into tomorrow, ideally until the end of tomorrow. Again, that childish belief that if certification happened on January 7th, it wouldn't count. He then asked the senator to object to every state, to give us the opportunity to get the legislatures who are very, very close to pulling their votes. This concession that legislatures had not yet asked to review their slates stood in contrast to Giuliani's and the defendant's lies at the ellipse that they already had. Next, in a voicemail intended for another senator, this is all, you'll see why this is funny. You probably already know. Giuliani told more lies. He falsely claimed that Pence's decision not to use the defendant's fraudulent elector certificates had been surprising, and that in light of the surprise, we could use a little time so that the state legislatures can prepare even more to come to you and say, please give this back to us for a while so we can fix it. Giuliani then repeated knowingly false claims of election fraud, including that non-citizens had voted in Arizona and an outcome-determinative number of underage voters, and this is a new one, had cast ballots in Georgia. The kids are clamoring to vote. Underage, sure. Although the attack on the Capitol successfully delayed the certification for approximately 6 hours, the House and Senate resumed the joint session at 11:35 p.m., but the conspirators were not done. Within 10 minutes at 11:44 p.m., Eastman, who earlier that day wrote to Greg Jacob that, quote, "This siege is because you and your boss did not do what was necessary." He emailed Jacob again and urged him to convince Pence to violate the law, writing, "I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation of the ECA." He knew it was a violation. "And adjourn for 10 days. To allow the legislatures to finish their investigations, which weren't going on anyway, as well as to allow a full forensic audit, which means nothing, of the massive amount of illegal activity that has occurred here." At 3:41 a.m. on January 7th, as President of the Senate, Pence announced the certified results of the 2020 presidential election in favor of Biden. That's the end of the factual recitation that's part of this motion. We actually made it all the way through. We're on page 85 of 165. I don't know how much of this is end notes, but anyway, that's really remarkable. They didn't get around to explaining why I was chuckling again that they were forced to say in a voicemail intended for another senator. Remember when we read yesterday, this part was news, when Giuliani was trying to text to state legislators, I think some of the leaders of the state legislature in Wisconsin, the Republican leaders, and he got the number wrong and texted the plans to somebody else. I don't know whether it was, another legislator or just somebody random in Wisconsin, and he got the whole plan wrong. I don't think that there was no indication that the Republican leaders in Wisconsin were willing to go along with this thing, whether they got the text or not. But it was just funny that he got the number wrong, because he got the number wrong on some of these voicemails. He thought he was calling Tommy Tuberville, right? But he ended up calling somebody else and leaving the message with them. Just, astonishing incompetence all around. But, he was probably drunk. In his defense, he was wrong, idiotic, a traitor, and drunk. So, that's the defense. Just putting that out there. I'm sorry, Your Honor, I was a drunk traitor. I think that's an excuse. Well, we're on, if we want, to read about the legal framework of things. That's Section 2 of this brief. And I mean, at this point, we might as well throw it on the record because, hell, we are almost over and out of time again. Let's read it. Legal framework. In Trump, meaning the case, styled, of course, Trump v. U.S., in the earlier proceedings, the Supreme Court held that former presidents are immune from prosecution for core official acts, enjoy at least a rebuttable presumption of immunity for their other official acts, and have no immunity for unofficial acts. That was their one concession to reality, and remanded to this court for further proceedings consistent with its holding. This section sets forth, that is Section 2, sets forth the applicable legal principles, and then Section 3 applies them to the categories of conduct that the superseding indictment alleges and that the government intends to prove at trial in order to demonstrate that none of the defendant's conduct is immunized, even under this stupid Supreme Court ruling. In the earlier proceedings, the Supreme Court announced the principles that govern a former president's claim of constitutional immunity from federal criminal prosecution. He doesn't have any, but they decided to make some up, and here they are. The Supreme Court divided presidential acts into 3 categories. 1, core presidential conduct that Congress has no power to regulate, and for which a former president has absolute immunity. And I think, their excuse here is they're talking about if you declare war or order troops into what they call kinetic activity now, even under the War Powers Act. As an emergency response, you can't be held responsible for exercising that power or prosecuted later for, say war crimes, at least not in the United States. If they get a hold of you internationally, not too much we can do about it, but the idea is sometimes the president has to do things, and sometimes it'll turn out later that things weren't done quite right. For those things that are, I guess, core to the protection of the United States, the national security, etc., they prefer that there be immunity. The other things, the other categories, number 2, other official presidential acts for which the president has at least presumptive immunity. Not sure exactly what those are going to be, but I think they'll explain it. And 3, unofficial conduct for which the president has no immunity. That's why all of this reiteration that these are campaign rallies, that are campaign staff, that they're privately arranged, privately funded. They don't even pretend at the time that it has anything to do with the official duties of the presidency. With respect to the first category of core official conduct, when the president's authority to act is, quote, conclusive and preclusive, Congress may not regulate his actions, and the president has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution. That's what they're saying. And let's see. Applying those principles to the original indictment, the Supreme Court concluded that the defendant is, quote, absolutely immune from prosecution for the alleged conduct involving his discussions with Justice Department officials and his threatened removal of the acting attorney general. The superseding indictment omits those allegations, and the Supreme Court did not find that any other conduct alleged in the original indictment implicated, quote, conclusive and preclusive presidential authority. In other words, the limit of the Supreme Court's overt claims of total immunity would apply to the president dealing with his own Department of Justice. The threshold question here, then, is whether the defendant can carry his burden to establish that his acts were official and thus subject to presumptive immunity, right? Everything other than his communications with the Justice Department would fall under either unofficial or official, but not core presidential acts. Okay. So, official conduct includes acts taken within the outer perimeter of the president's official responsibilities, covering actions so long as they are, quote, not manifestly or palpably beyond his authority. But consistent with the D.C. Circuit opinion in the Blassingame case, the Supreme Court suggested that a president who speaks as a candidate for office or as a party leader, as the defendant did here, does not act in his official presidential capacity. As the D.C. Circuit explained, a president acting as a candidate for re-election is, to that extent, not carrying out an official responsibility. Citing again the Blasingame case, which read, apparently in relevant part, when a sitting president running for re-election speaks in a campaign ad or in accepting his political party's nomination at the party convention, he typically speaks on matters of public concern, yet he does so in an unofficial private capacity as an office seeker, not as an official in his official capacity as office holder. And actions taken in an unofficial capacity cannot qualify for official act immunity. To assess whether a presidential action constitutes an official act, courts must apply an objective analysis that focuses on the content, form, and context of the conduct in question. A president's motives for undertaking the conduct and the fact that the conduct is alleged to have violated a generally applicable law are not relevant considerations. If a president's actions constitute non-core official presidential conduct, he is at least presumptively immune from criminal prosecution for that conduct. The government can overcome that presumptive immunity by demonstrating that applying a criminal prohibition to that act would pose no dangers of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch. Just as the inquiry into whether conduct is official or unofficial is necessarily fact-bound, right? Just as the inquiry into is necessarily fact-bound, with the necessary analysis being fact-specific, so too should be the inquiry into whether any presumption of immunity is rebutted under the circumstances. That's the reason, the justification for giving that factual recitation, which we just spent 2 days reading. The analysis should first identify the specified alleged act at issue and then determine whether criminal liability for the act intrudes on a relevant executive branch authority or function, taking care not to conceive of the inquiry at too high a level of generality. That quoting a different D.C. Circuit case, Banneker Ventures, LLC versus Graham. Such an approach recognizes that executive authority has limits, boundaries imposed by constitutional text, separation of powers, and precedent, and that the application of criminal law to the president's official conduct does not, per se, intrude impermissibly on executive branch authority and functions. These principles for assessing whether the conduct alleged in the superseding indictment is immune apply equally to evidence. The government may not introduce evidence of immunized official conduct against the former president at trial, even to prove that the former president committed a crime predicated on unofficial conduct. A little weedy, but that's actually the sum total of Section 2. The motion now moves to Section 3, which we won't have time to read through, but we'll tell you is styled, none of the allegations or evidence is protected by presidential immunity, having laid out the tests to be applied as described by the Supreme Court. Smith applies those tests and comes to the conclusion that none of the charges in the superseding indictment, the one that eliminated the ones that they did immunize, discussions with the Justice Department, none of the remaining charges should be subject to immunity. At its core, the defendant's scheme was a private one. He extensively used private actors and his campaign infrastructure to attempt to overturn the election results and operated in a private capacity as a candidate for office. To the limited extent that the superseding indictment and proffered evidence reflect official conduct, however, the government can rebut the presumption of immunity because relying on that conduct in this prosecution will not pose a danger of intrusion on the authority or functions of the executive branch. Below, the government categorizes the conduct outlined in Section 1 and provides content, form, and context for this court to determine that the defendant's conduct was private or that in the alternative, any presumptive immunity is rebutted under the circumstances. This analysis is necessarily fact-intensive, and all of the government's analysis below, the stuff yet to come, is based on the unique facts and circumstances of this case. You get the sense of what's going to happen here, that they are saying that anything that he even claims was official, not core presidential act, but anything he claims was official, was paid for, arranged, and executed by non-official resources. That tends to give away the game. And and not only that, but in many cases, as we've mentioned along the way, he is intervening in areas of government function in which there is no presidential role. There's no presidential role in counting the electoral votes, certifying the electoral votes. It's in fact that the presiding officer's job is assigned to someone else completely. It's very difficult. It's certainly impossible to claim that they're core presidential powers. They're not presidential powers at all. Well, is he at least acting in his official capacity? He has no official capacity in this. It's impossible to do so. All right. So that really gets us through it. I'll give you one more paragraph that's introductory before they start to get into the legal analysis because, of course, we're out of time. This section, Section 3, if you decide to read it later on, will address the defendant's interactions with Pence because the Supreme Court held that when a defendant conversed with Pence about their official responsibilities, that conduct was official. Okay. Accordingly, the government explains below why any presumptive immunity as to the defense's official conduct regarding Pence is rebutted, other than the specific official conduct related to Pence that the Supreme Court held to be official. None of the defendant's other actions were official. This section categorizes that conduct, provides the content, form, and context that establish its unofficial nature. The categories are A, the defendant's interactions as a candidate with state officials, B, the defendant's efforts as a candidate to organize fraudulent electors, C, the defendant's public speeches, tweets, and other public statements as a candidate, D, the defendant's interactions as a candidate with White House staff, and E, other evidence of the defendant's knowledge and intent. Lastly, even if these categories of conduct and evidence were to be deemed official, the government can rebut the attendant presumption of immunity as described below. Now that's about as far as we can carry you today. I recommend that you take some time perhaps over the weekend. I don't know if we're going to be able to just keep filling shows like this, but it was an extraordinary opportunity. I thank you for allowing me to do it. I thank you, Justice, for letting me run over yesterday and today. But as usual, in case you want some other news, Justice Putnam rides to the rescue with the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy next.
NetworksRadio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
What do you think he's got on tap for you? Well, Fox News has totally lost it over Trump's plan gone wrong. What about other stuff? A federal judge elsewhere has ruled against the correctional health care giant WellPath after the company's leaders intentionally destroyed email evidence in order to prevent its use at trial. You're not supposed to do that. Stay tuned to find out why.